Tricky part is the laptop and the camera are not aligned. So if it looks like I'm not making eye contact, it's probably because I'm looking at the top. Let's do this. Do I need to introduce myself? Yeah. Or do they have an anonymous policy thing? I think it's going to be more funny if they have to bleep it out. All right. Hello, I am Kenneth Williams, and my presentation is titled Change is Never Easy. Now, the documents Moral Courage and Intelligent Disobedience by Ted Thomas and Ira Shaleff and Franklin D. Roosevelt's inaugural address both have a theme of progress and change. Roosevelt's address discusses how the United States needs to move forward despite the challenges that are being brought on by the Great Depression. Thomas and Shallow's paper discusses how intelligent disobedience can prevent avoidable failures and harm, and how it's important for the military. One person's action of intelligent disobedience can change the lives of others by preventing them from suffering harm. But how change should happen within the United States has been and is still controversial. Currently, colleges around the United States have seen large numbers of students protesting. I'm citing AP News for this one. Despite most protests being peaceful, there's a lot of police involvement, which has led to controversy over how a protest should be run. Some argue that these protests are too disruptive. Others argue that, well, it's peaceful, even though on a technical level it is illegal because it still counts as trespassing for legal purposes. Now, this raises the question, to what extent can change in civil rights in the United States be secured through only peaceful, lawful, and non-disruptive protest? Change, for the purposes of this presentation, will be defined as any major change to laws, practices, or U.S. involvement not directly related to civil rights. U.S. involvement could include things like military alliance, or what countries the United States is supporting, etc. Civil rights is essentially equal treatment under the law, such as right to marriage. Legal means no laws broken. Peaceful, meaning nonviolent, no intentional damage or harm to property. Non-disruptive, no intentional direct disturbance of people's day-to-day lives, such as blocking a road or other means of transportation. Now, taking a look at legality, under the First Amendment, the United States government cannot restrict freedom of speech or the people's right to peacefully assemble, or the people's right to petition the government. Unless there is a clear and present danger, a protest that is peaceful should technically be lawful. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It supersedes any other laws. But these protections can vary. First Amendment rights aren't always upheld by law enforcement. In Agents of Change, How the Police and Courts Misuse the Law to Silence Mass Protests by Abbey, investigates how law enforcement can be used to harm protesters and how a court can use simple trespassing laws to halt protests. Law enforcement officers have, in the past and sometimes in the present, committed violent acts against protesters and arrested them under trespassing charges. Often these trespassing charges are held up by courts. And this can greatly restrict a protest and movement's ability to happen effectively and lawfully. While this source is focuses on slightly older protests, such as some that happened in the 90s and 80s, it's still relevant to this day because trespassing charges are still being used to restrict protests. From a social standpoint, Schumann et al. Found that using a mix of violent and non-violent protests can increase support for police reform. This was specifically looking at its effect on conservative support. And notably, there was more support when there was a mixture of protest use. However, this doesn't mean that only violent or only non-violent protests are effective. So it could be said that violence is not necessary for a movement to be successful. It could be peaceful as well. But in terms of lawfulness, well, Moral Courage and Intelligent Disobedience by Ted Thomas and Ira Shaleff discussed how intelligent disobedience in the military is a moral obligation, and in the military, a legal obligation. While this disobedience often had backlash, it has very quick and immediate impacts because A, an order that is unjust is not carried out, or B, people are forced to confront the fact that an unjust law is real and impacting people. Yes, civil disobedience might not be protected by law outside of the military, but sometimes a proper procedure is not enough to stop injustice. Oops. Lastly, a historical standpoint. The civil rights movement is often seen as a model of what a movement should be like. It focused on nonviolent protests, using methods like sit-ins to draw attention and often to bring legal challenges to court to confront segregation. But the sit-ins, again, were not entirely legal because of the infamous trespassing charges that were used against protesters. You have the right to protest, but often that right can be stripped with simple charges like trespassing. So, connecting all of these lenses, though the right to protest is legally protected, that protection isn't always upheld. Civil disobedience is often the most effective way of bringing change and getting public attention for an issue because law enforcement is often involved in restricting protest rights. Additionally, violent protests are often only violent because of law enforcement intervention. Take a look at, say, Stonewall. The violence is also not strictly necessary for a movement to be successful. And while a movement does not necessarily need to break the law to be successful, most traditional forms of protest find themselves being challenged or restricted by law enforcement. So, what does this mean? It means that the evidence discussed suggests that change can't happen in a wholly peaceful, lawful, and non disruptive manner. But this doesn't need to be the case. Yes, the First Amendment protects the right to protest, but this isn't usually what happens. So, for change to be able to happen peacefully and within the boundaries of law, there needs to be more of an effort to ensure that protests are genuinely a protected form of expression. Violence does not need to happen, and the majority of violent protests are violent because of law enforcement or an external countering force. Conclusion: no, change in civil rights currently cannot, in the United States, currently cannot be secured through wholly peaceful and lawful means. Even peaceful means of protest can turn violent because of mishandling of situations by law enforcement and courts. But violence, disruption, and the breaking of the law could be minimized by expanding the protections of protest rights. Sources cited. Oof, that's rough. Because I had my passport here. They really want you to use Teams, huh? Yeah, I can just put it on whatever what is it called, OneDrive, and just email it to you. All right. Initially, my research question was, like I did in the presentation, derived from, like, almost directly from the stimulus sources. I was looking and trying to connect the dots there. From there, my question pretty much changed based on the information I could find. Um, I'd say that it was kind of shaped by the research. Initially, it was more along the lines of just general, can change happen through peaceful means. But as I did, especially legal research, it started to evolve towards, can change happen through exclusively peaceful and lawful means in the United States? Because I realized, well, laws are going to be very different for different countries. This would be a difficult question to answer on a global scale. So I started focusing my research more towards what's happening in the United States, what are the legal protections and restrictions within the United States. And from there, it started focusing more on protests because that is generally throughout history going to be the most common form of change, which is what I discovered in my research. I think in terms of further avenues of studies, there would definitely be something more along the lines of how police involvement affects violent protests. Because, as I discussed in my presentation, a lot of violent protests don't start out as violent. I'd like to know how many, infamous, I suppose, riots occurred specifically because of excessive police or possibly corporate involvement or legal involvement. I'm going to share the presentation.